Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark McNack, and my co-host Robert Brandt and I continue the engaging discussion in the second podcast with former Chief Ouray Crowfoot of Siksika Nation in Alberta, Canada. We get into the specific investment opportunities and how international capital can engage with First Nations at scale. Today's conversation covers Siksika's real asset portfolio, infrastructure assets like bridges, pipelines, and hotels, such as a 35% stake in the Kananaskis Lodge, where the G Summit was recently held by Prime Minister Mark Carney on behalf of the Government of Canada. You'll discover why Siksika is generating $200 to $300 million in annual excess capital and where that money is being deployed. Chief Ouray Crowfoot also shares his vision for a $100 million private equity account focused on emerging sectors like AI, following the model of Colorado's Southern Utes, who manage a $13 billion trust. For UK and continental European investors, this is particularly insightful. You'll hear Chief Crowfoot's direct interest in the upcoming Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit, his framework for evaluating international partnerships, and critically, how to actually present opportunities to Siksika and other capital-rich First Nations. When a community is fielding opportunities from Australia, New Zealand, China, and beyond, understand how to properly engage becomes essential to winning the business. You'll also hear why Chief Ouray Crowfoot believes First Nations must be at the table, not on the menu, and what that means for institutional capital seeking to invest in Canada. With some of the investments that your nation has made, where are you putting some of that money to get those returns over time?
Right now, the bulk of our money are in our investment managers, and so we have a wide variety of in our portfolio. We have some non-liquid assets as well, such as hotels, investing in some of these assets, such as bridges, pipelines, that kind of stuff. We've had trust accounts for 2-3 decades at Siksika, 2 decades at least. But this one here is pretty unique. And so right now, it's not like winning the lottery, but it kind of is, because up until now, our Treasury Board essentially was just rolling budgets. Like we weren't making enough money from our other trusts to really kind of plan, other than just subsidize our lack of federal funding. And so we weren't bringing in $200, $300 million of excess dollars annually as we are now. And so now, we have to train up our Treasury Board, we have to train up our council, because now you have a greater fiduciary obligation, you have greater fiduciary liabilities, more money, more problems kind of thing, but, and so initially, my initial goal was saying, let's start out with 2 investment managers. So we have one RBC Trust investment managers and then TD investment managers. And, and they had similar portfolios, but a little bit different. And so my goal is, as we grow our Treasury Board, as we grow that knowledge of investing, to become a lot more specialized. Now we're looking at a small cap manager but we haven't got there yet. I didn't want to bring on, hey, this is our emerging markets guy, this is our growth guy, this is our small caps guy. Let's have 2 initial, and so everybody on the reserve was comfortable with the RBCs and the TDs and the BMO, the big banks, right? And so let's bring those on initially. So we brought those 2 on initially, and said, okay, now as we train people up, let's bring in a growth guy. Let's bring in an emerging markets guy. So I think that's the plan in the next few years, to start getting more specialized in our areas of investing. But we haven't gotten there yet either. And now that I'm not chief, maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but I would love to see Siksika develop its own private equity account on its own, where they said, you know what? Yeah, this bigger trust is for all these other things, but let's pull $100 million or whatever out of that and put it in, some more non-liquid type investments, whether that be AI, whatever that may be, right? But we have to have a whole team. We got to have a team of that strategy as well. And it's not my fully idea. I saw this with the Southern Utes down in Colorado. They have I don't know, $13-14 billion trust account, USD. And, just for example, in the U.S. right now, Trump shut down the government. He cut off a program called SNAP, which, doesn't just affect First Nation. It was essentially like a foods program for the less fortunate. And so you never know. You never know what's going to be shut off. And so in conversations with some of these guys from the Southern Utes, that was their whole plan, is like, we want to be able to have our own private equity account. So if anything goes awry, we can fully rely upon ourselves. And we have that full reliance upon our own earnings, our own equity. Now we're going towards that direction, but we've only been in this billionaires club for 2 years, and so so I think there's a lot of opportunities for Siksika if guided the right way. And although I'm not the chief right now, and I've only not been chief less than a week, and so I haven't even had time to come up with a plan of like, okay, what's next steps. But I did tell my cousin, and again, it's easier because he's my cousin, but I don't want to rely on it because he's my cousin. But I said, look, if you need some financial guidance, I can kind of help out for a little while, but we need to develop that outside of the Treasury Board, look at examples such as the Southern Utes and what are we going to do to build another kind of growth. We do have an economic development corporation on the reserve, and they have some investments in hotels like the Kananaskis Lodge, where they had the G7 summit. We're 35% owners of that hotel. We're 95% owners of another hotel. It's called the Westin over here in Calgary by the airport. And we're at least 50% owners in a few other hotels. So we have a decent hospitality portfolio, but we also need to diversify that portfolio out a little bit more. And so we've already started a little bit. We're not calling that a growth fund, but it's essentially our own private equity kind of account. But I think we need to build that out a little bit more.
Fascinating. So a lot of our audience over here would be thinking, well, how do we go present ourselves? How do we get on your roster? Because I'm sure you're going to look at global talent, right? Not just in the neighborhood.
Exactly.
So who do they contact? What's the email? What's the package you want to see?
Yeah, for sure. As of right now, you can send that stuff to me and I can kind of try to forward it. We're hiring a CEO as we speak for the ECDev Corporation. And so, we're growing. That's good and bad. We got some growing pains, but we're trying to find that right fit of those people that can understand these different portfolios, because up until now, we've primarily focused on the reserve, and that's been the primary focus. But now that we've, you have a B behind your name instead of an M behind your name, you start getting the phone calls from Australia, from New Zealand, from all over the world about, different opportunities. And if you're not equipped to be able to kind of like sort out these opportunities and even have a strategy to say, okay, these are the kind of opportunities we want in our portfolio, then you start kind of saying, oh, you start, every shiny object, you start, bouncing between, and so do we want to go, coal over here, or do we want to go oil? Do we want to go renewable? What do we want to do? Like, guys, we're reacting on whoever's calling. We got to not be reactive. We got to be proactive. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is build out our team to be more proactive instead of reactive. Because again, like you said, when you start hearing of some of these First Nations that have a B behind their name, and there's actually starting to be a few out of the 660 odd First Nation in Canada. Unfortunately, the bulk of them are still in the poverty area, and unfortunately. But fortunately, there are a handful of First Nations that are leading the area in exporting or ports or whatever it may be. And so you are starting to see First Nations that people are taking more serious, and people are saying, wow, you know what, we have a chief I think I'm the first chief in Canada history that's a CPA. I haven't did the full Google search on it, but I've worked for two of the big four accounting firms, and so that kind of knowledge. I don't think you have to be a CPA or you have to be an investment banker or you have to be a lawyer to be a chief, but it doesn't hurt. I mean, I think that's the direction that some of these First Nations are moving toward. You're seeing more younger, educated chiefs. So, some of the older chiefs, they bring a lot of that traditional knowledge, which is in key as well. You need to have that traditional blend. And then that's what I said before. My mom was like, you got to have a drum in one hand and the computer in the other hand, because if you just have all the modern day, KPMG and all that knowledge, but no traditional knowledge, you're in the same boat as a non-First Nation person. So you need to have that balance. And so some of those older chiefs, I think they're starting to have more liaisons or advisors that are versed up. But I think First Nations are now starting to build up those. And the direction, in my opinion, that Canada's moving, I do feel like Canada's going to be, now this is my personal opinion, based on my experience, but I think Canada's drive is going to be towards moving away from the Indian Act and moving away from funding First Nations. We're going to, quote unquote, get out of the Indian business. So I do think that's going to happen, or Canada's going to try for that to happen in the next 10 years. And so First Nations, in my opinion, need to start saying, okay, you know what? If that happens, or something towards that direction happens, we need to be prepared. We need to have our own accounts. We need to have our own funding. And people say, "Oh, that'll never happen." Well, look down in the States. I mean, shutting off SNAP and shutting off certain programs, although that wasn't First Nation exactly directed, it has a big impact on a lot of First Nations. And if you don't have your own resources, if you don't have your own, less that reliance upon the government, you're going to be in a bad spot. And so, even though we have the billion now, we need to have the 4 billion. We need to have those reserves built up and our resources built up. Just, if it doesn't happen, fine, but you need to be ready for that kind of movement. And I think that's where you see some like net resource sharing, some equity inclusion. And I think now First Nations are getting more savvy when it comes to the business part and, being connected with some of these corporations. I think 20, 30, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, I don't think a lot of First Nations would have said, let's go to this economic summit in England. Why would we go to an economic summit in England? Why would we even leave our local communities, right? But now, especially with COVID and some of these negatives, we can look at these negatives and go, well, even right now, I don't think we would have had this podcast across the pond if we didn't have COVID. And so you take some of these negative situations and you say, well, how can we make the best out of them? And so, our world, through AI, through technology, through whatever it may be, the world's getting smaller and smaller. Again, 20 years ago, I don't think we would even consider business in Switzerland or business in Japan or business in China or anywhere outside of Canada. And now you are seeing First Nations. Me and a small group of our Siksika guys, we went to China 2 years ago. We looked at a business opportunity in Shanghai. It ended up not working out, but not because it was in China, because of the economic environment, the political environment kind of made it difficult, for those kind of things. So there's barriers there. But I think First Nations now are starting to say, well, let's go to China, let's go to New Zealand, let's go to England. And they're coming here, I know that one of these coal mines by the Eastern Slopes, an Australian company owned it at one point, and it ended up not panning out. But again, There's Australians that are meeting with Siksika. The world is not as big as it used to be. Our technology has made it a lot smaller. And I think the global economy, especially, again, even the Trump stuff, because Canada may not want to admit it, but they were pretty reliant upon the U.S. for everything. Jokingly, the 51st state comments, I'm Canadian and I'm American, so I can kind of all see on both sides. Now, Canada takes a lot of pride in being Canada, and they'll never be a 51st state, but they did act like a 51st state. And so by some of these comments that President Trump's made, it's forced Canada to say, wow, we are pretty reliant upon the U.S. How do we become less reliant on the U.S.? How can we need to build our own, because Canada has a lot of natural resources, a lot of oil, a lot of gold, a lot of all these, a lot of the fresh water. A lot of these natural resources come from Canada. And a lot of these natural resources are in First Nations communities. And so, before 30, 40, 50 years ago, these corporations would just come on and honestly just take advantage of First Nations and exploit First Nations. But now I think a lot of these chiefs and councils and executives and advisors on these First Nations are more business savvy. And so now they're saying, look, we don't mind being partners. We want to be partners with you, but we want to be partners. We don't want to be exploited. So, if we can come up with some partnerships that are equitable, some equitable treatment, then we're open for business. And that's the attitude Siksika has. We're open for business. We want to partner up with corporations and the like, partnerships with, I've made a lot of connections through the multiple business CEOs and business leaders in Calgary and Canada. And I want them to know our name. I want them to be. I wear this shirt almost as this is my uniform as chief, even though it's a polo. But it was branded. Everywhere I went, they knew who Siksika was. They knew who Chief Crowfoot was. And I want the ATCOs, the TC Energies, all these major corporations. When they say, who do we go talk to? I want Siksika to be at the front of their mind. And there's a saying, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And so we've been on the menu long enough. We want to be at the table. And so I think that's the attitude. I can't speak for all the First Nations, but I think that's the attitude that I'm seeing as I go to these major projects or these major coalitions and these major expansions, not just in Canada, but worldwide, is, we want to be at that conversation. So I've never been to the economic summit in London, but if I go this year, I'll be really looking forward to it, because I love to see the mindset and who's out there and the connectivities. And because when it comes to the especially Native world, it's a small group that's interconnected. And so, by having that small group that's interconnected, a lot of business can be done, in my opinion.
Love it. Love those messages.
Ouray, so one other question. With everything you're talking about, the excitement, and you were very fortunate. You have been very fortunate in your own career. You've obviously worked hard to achieve it, but you recognize what needed to be done. What about capacity building for the younger members?
We used to hire only people from Siksika. That when I first started, they only hired people from Siksika. And I'm all for hiring our own people. But now we're a multi-billion-dollar First Nation. So, we need to bring on expertise. And so we had to bring on people that weren't from Siksika, weren't First Nations. And, in these roles as CPA, as CFO, and the like, right? Now, I want to train up our own people. I want to train up engineers. We need engineers. We need accountants. We need, in all these areas of professionalism. One of the things that we're fortunate at, we have a college at Siksika. And we've also made a stance. Like I said before, my mother was a big pusher of education. And one of the things that in the funding arrangement that Canada has, they have this a funding formula, if you will, and here's how we're going to fund First Nations going to post-secondary university. And we're gonna prioritize them by this, and this, and it's just, for example, if a young lady went 3 years of university, and then she had a baby, or something happened, and her mother got sick, or some kid's father got sick, or whatever it may be, and they had to take a year off. Well, now they're not priority one. Now they're priority 4 or 5 or whatnot, right? And so maybe they don't get funded anymore because you only get X amount of funds, right? And so a lot of people we saw were had 2-3 years of university under their belt, but they never went back to school after that. And I started asking around. I was like, well, why didn't you finish? Well, we didn't get funded, and I was, once you're placed in the priority 5 or 6, chances of going back up to priority 1 are slim. And so we made a motion at our council, I think maybe 4 or 5 years back, that we're going to fund every student at Siksika based on Old Son's criteria, not based on Canada's Indian Affairs' criteria. Now, again, those dollars came out of our pocket. And every First Nation doesn't have that luxury of saying, we're going to fund our students. We're going to fund all of our students. But I saw that as a necessity. I saw that as an investment. If we don't invest in our kids and we don't invest in that education, then how can we be upset when we don't have engineers, when we don't have doctors, when we don't have lawyers, when we don't have all these professional areas that we lacked, if we don't provide those opportunities. And now again, another saying that I'm kind of known for saying is I'm a big believer in a hand up, not a handout. There's a lot of barriers, not just First Nation people, but a lot of barriers our young people have today. And so if we can remove some of those barriers, and one of them being a barrier for education, then it just takes a less of that stress off of that person, And so that's one of the things that we've announced. We've announced that, we're funding all of our students right now at Siksika. So a lot of that, we won't necessarily see those dividends till maybe 4 or 5 years. You have to cycle through some university. But I'm a firm believer that, that's going to pay off big down the road. The more people we have graduating from university, the more people we have, and even in high school. So, if we make that announcement at post-secondary that we're going to fund all of our post-secondary students, then somebody that's in high school, they might have thought, well, our family just don't go to college. We just don't go to university. And that's the thinking on some First Nations is what's the use? Why do we go to university if we're not going to get funded the whole way through, or something's going to happen? And so we're trying to instill some of those conversations in grade 8, grade 9, grade 10, not wait for post-secondary, not wait for them to get into college. So those are some of the proactive kind of measures that we're taking now. And then the ones that are in, say we have, so even like with engineering, we have our own engineering department at Siksika. And I don't think many First Nations have their own engineering department. And again, it takes dollars to do these things, and so a lot of First Nations, and even us, 10 years ago, we were fully relying on whatever engineer came on to do the work, and a lot of times with Indian Affairs or Indigenous Services Canada, it's, hey, you have to take the lowest bid. You have to take the cheapest guy. And so we were building, because we had to, because that's all we had available was those funds from the federal government. And the federal government saying you have to get the cheapest person, then you're going to get the cheapest quality product. And, you're going to have buildings tearing down, houses tearing down, roads not the best quality. And so we created our own engineering department, our own engineering team. Again, that's funded by us. And so we've also, now we have a few students that are in university now or have recently graduated that can be mentored through our own engineering department. And so, we're starting to see some of those dividends already pay off. But I think that's more of a long-term payoff than it is a short-term payoff. And so, again, when I went back and said, it's not about the 1.3 billion. It's about the opportunities that, because, it's not all about the money, but without money, you can't do these programs. You can't do these initiatives. You can't do these incentives. And so we want to be able to incentivize some of our people and not just the distribution, but rent assistance. That's a big issue across the world. Is not just First Nation people, but everybody is trying to find affordable housing. And trying to find somewhere to rent, and so that's a program that we're working on. I'm not the chief anymore, so I can't commit to that, but we are working on some rent assistance and those kind of things. And so I think the more of these barriers that we kind of either break down or remove, the better the payout's going to be for our people and down the road.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. And I think you've just reinforced some of the most competitive firms and individuals that Canada has today are the Indigenous peoples who are engaged and leading. And Canada needs to relearn the ability to compete on the world stage. So I'm sure you and your colleagues will be contributing that. But Ouray, it's been a pleasure to have you on here. And I think it also demonstrates the benefit of being in a nice place where you are, to be able to look out at white snow for most of the year, to think of, look at what you've achieved. Perhaps if you'd been down south still in North Carolina, the environment would have been conducive for that strategic thinking that you've helped your nation with.
Yeah, I definitely wasn't planning on moving back to Canada. I wasn't planning on being chief. I wasn't planning on my mother getting cancer. But that's life. You can't count on all those things. I do feel like where I'm at now was where I was supposed to be. I was supposed to be chief. I was supposed to help us out with those negotiations and set up that trust account. And now I'm unemployed. Now I got to figure out.
I don't think you will be for long.
Step.
And you better get over to the summit, April 8th. We would love to have you and some of your colleagues come over and join us. We'll send you some further information about that. But it has been a real honor to speak with you, and we appreciate you joining us on our podcast.
And likewise, Mark, it's really great to meet you and to meet Rob. And again, I think that's as we grow as a nation, as we grow as an economy, as we grow as a world, it's not about who's First Nation, who's not First Nation. We just got to take people that are like-minded and smart people and say, hey, you know what? Let's push this initiative forward.
Yes.
And I think that's the direction we're going. We may not be as fast as some people want it to be, but I think that's the direction that we're going. And I think that you will see a stronger Canada. You'll see a stronger First Nation, and ultimately it ends up being a stronger world economy.
Well, thank you again, Nyawa, Ouray Crowfoot, Chief Crowfoot, once a chief, always a chief. Appreciate your time and your thoughts and your leadership that you've shown, and look forward to the next stage of your career.
Yes. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you to Chief Ouray Crowfoot for sharing his insights with us, and thank you for viewing and listening. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2026 summit taking place on the 8th of April. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.